on the supplementary estimate for the Home Office and the debate on the spending of the Home Office on asylum and migration. The debate will be led by Dame Diana Johnson. I must announce that the Speaker has selected the amendment in the name of Alison Thewliss, and I will call Alison Thewliss during the debate to move the amendment. Minister, to move the motion formally.
I beg to move.
The question is as on the order paper. Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I start by thanking the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate this afternoon. I think we can all agree that it is an important and vital job for Parliament to scrutinise government spending, and in this particular case, in this debate, the Home Office budget on asylum and migration, which is an issue that I know every member of this House cares about and the public are rightly concerned about too. Over the past 5 years, the Home Office's asylum support, resettlement and accommodation budget has increased by 733%. This represents a quarter of the total expenditure of the Home Office. And it is, of course, the Home Office's responsibility to enable scrutiny to take place with clear and transparent information being provided in a timely manner. Yet I have to say to the House, the Home Affairs Select Committee has been repeatedly hamstrung by the Home Office's refusal to disclose key details of its spending plans and commitments. We've had to repeatedly ask for information, and on several occasions we've worked with the Public Accounts Committee to get financial details which I believe should have been readily available to us. The House will know that the terms of reference for the Home Affairs Select Committee are to examine the expenditure, administration and policy of the Home Office and its associated public bodies. And we do this, of course, on behalf of the whole of the House of Commons. Ministers should not need reminding that parliamentary scrutiny is not a disposable luxury. The Department says it welcomes scrutiny, but unfortunately we haven't found that to be the reality. And I would argue it is a basic necessity for ensuring public money is well spent, appropriately and wisely. Yet time and time again our demands for financial transparency have been rebuffed by the Home Office, with Parliament and therefore the public kept in the dark about how the Department is spending billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. Members of this House have therefore been put in a position of not being able to ask crucial questions about spending plans until long after the money has left the government coffers. So today's debate will shine a light on the position the Home Office is in and show, and I believe highlight, the urgent need for the Home Office and ministers to change their approach to being scrutinised. So, to set out the current position of the Home Office, they have requested £5.9 billion in additional funding through the supplementary estimates. £4 billion for asylum, £1.2 billion for implementation of the illegal migration bill, stroke the 10-point plan, and £0.5 billion for the Afghanistan resettlement schemes. Turning first to the Home Office's spending on the asylum system, the Department has not disclosed its spending plans and commitments when publishing and setting out its plans for the year on asylum, I would argue in a timely manner, preventing that full and proper parliamentary scrutiny. What seems to have happened is that the Home Office, in agreement with the Treasury, completely omitted a significant proportion of expected asylum expenditure from the Home Office's main estimates. This meant that Parliament did not get to scrutinise the Department's spending plans until after that money has been spent. The Department is now seeking retrospective approval at the supplementary estimate stage. This goes against the very principles of the estimates approvals process. And I do question why the Home Office was not in a position, with all the sophisticated modelling that they have at their disposal, to at least make available a notional figure to put into their budget under this heading, which would of course have needed to have increased if necessary, but the fact that there was nothing put in the budget at the start I think is actually wrong. Now what has happened as well is that on the 1st of February this year the Home Secretary requested an emergency drawdown of £2.6 billion from the reserves, because the Department had run out of money before the supplementary estimates had been approved. So further, the level of detail provided on asylum spending in the supplementary estimates is also inadequate. A much more detailed breakdown of the asylum budget is required to fully understand the cost drivers and to hold the department to account for the decisions it's taking. But that, sadly, is not what we've been given. Expenditure on asylum has increased rapidly over the past 2 years. We know that levels of migration have increased due to a number of small boat crossings, the war in Ukraine and the Afghanistan resettlement scheme. And the 2021 spending review, the departmental settlement, was insufficient to cope with these growing pressures. As such, the department has made large claims on the reserves, as well as extending its use of the Overseas Development Assistance, or ODA, budget. Now, some pressures on the Home Office budget are beyond the department's direct control, or at least their immediate control, but others are not. And how the department delivers accommodation, for example, for asylum seekers, is down to them. And I think the committee has been very concerned that the former Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration said that the Home Office did not appear to have an asylum accommodation strategy. There is, of course, the point to make that the use of hotel accommodation is due to the backlog, or as the Home Secretary corrected me at the Home Affairs Select Committee, the queue. It's apparently not a backlog anymore, it's a queue. And the failure that that queue has been allowed to develop because of the failure of the Home Office not to invest in processing asylum claims in an efficient way over a number of years. And that has resulted in a much larger bill for accommodation that we're now having to deal with at this point. So we know currently that the Home Office is spending £8 million a day on accommodating asylum seekers in hotels, which amounts to £2.9 billion a year. Now, despite the Home Office spending this huge amount of money, it's not predominantly their money. The first 12 months of an asylum seeker's accommodation is funded through the Overseas Development Aid budget. Between 2021 and 22 to 2023-24, Home Office usage of the ODA budget increased by 226%, from 981 million to 3.2 billion. This forced the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office to cease all non-essential programmes as spending was redirected domestically. The implications of this have been heavily criticised by the Independent Commission for Aid Impact and also by the International Development Select Committee. We also know that the Illegal Migration Act, if implemented in full, will restrict the Home Office's ability to use the ODA budget, as migrants arriving irregularly will no longer be able to seek asylum, thereby cutting off Home Office access to ODA budgets for asylum seekers. Yes, I'm happy to give word.
A very important point about the use of ODA. Does she agree that there's nothing forcing the government to spend ODA in such a way, even if it has to count that expenditure as ODA, it could make up for that in the SCDO's budget if it wanted to? This is a choice that the government is making to take money away from the SCDO and spend it by the Home Office.
Yes, thank you. Thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and that's absolutely right. It's a choice. It's a choice by government. So I want to just put to the Minister, does he think that the spending of the £3.2 billion of the ODA budget on asylum accommodation in the UK is an appropriate use of that budget? And what does he say about the fact that the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office having to cease all their non-essential programmes, when we know that could be really important work in ensuring people stay in their home country and do not feel they have to leave and become migrants? And does the Minister have a plan for how the Home Office will fund asylum accommodation if it can no longer take money from the ODA budget? One of the Home Office's alternative approaches to accommodating some asylum seekers, a maximum I think of around 500 at a time, is the Bibby Stockholm barge. In January this year, the Home Office's Permanent Secretary informed the Home Office Committee, the Home Affairs Committee, that it cost £120 per night to accommodate a man on the Bibby Stockholm, compared with £140 a night in a hotel. This is based on full occupancy, but when we visited the barge in January, it was not fully occupied, and we were certainly led to believe that it would never reach the full capacity of 500. We were also aware that the initial figure that we've been given doesn't include the set-up costs of the barge, which amounted to around 22 million. The Permanent Secretary assured us that when set-up costs are included, there is a total life-saving from use of the Bibby Stockholm of £800,000. However, we understand the contract with the barge is only for 18 months. So could the Minister just confirm over what period that life-saving is calculated? And what level of occupancy does the Bibby Stockholm have when it ceases to be valued for money? And what levels have the average cost per person per night fluctuated between over the past year? Now, we put all these questions to the Permanent Secretary, and I'm also aware that the National Audit Office is conducting a value for money audit of asylum accommodation, but that won't be published until the 22nd of March. In recent oral evidence sessions with ministers, the Home Affairs Committee has repeatedly asked about finances in relation to the Bibby Stockholm and other asylum accommodation sites, with sadly with few meaningful replies. I also just want to raise a couple of other things just on this point. One is about what specifically is driving the capital budget increase in asylum costs. In the Home Office proposal, the capital DEL budget will go up to 1,399.8 million, an increase of 468.5 million. That's a 50%, over 50% increase compared with the initial budget of 931.3 million. Is it due to the Prime Minister's announcement in June 23 that 2 other barges had been procured as well as the Bibby Stockholm, but there's no explicit reference of that in the estimates memorandum? Or is it for the additional detention facilities required under the Illegal Migration Act? And secondly, why have the costs for processing asylum claims gone from £9,000 in 2019 to £21,000 in 22-23? That's a real terms increase of 109%. I now want to turn to the Home Office spending on the UK-Rwanda partnership. Again, it's a familiar story. The Home Affairs Committee has finally been able to glean that large sums of money have been committed to this scheme, but largely via retrospective disclosures and an accidental leak in an IMF board paper in Rwanda. HoC again has had to join forces with the Public Accounts Committee to ask the National Audit Office to find out the costings of the scheme. I would reiterate it's very unsatisfactory when going about our normal scrutiny sessions with ministers and officials to try and get detail on spending and any further commitments to have repeatedly been met with silence from ministers and being told to wait until the accounts for the department are published at the end of the financial year. Let's be clear, this failure to respond to our requests is not because anyone behind the scenes has judged the value for money test of this policy to be so overwhelmingly watertight that disclosures to Parliament are completely unnecessary, unsatisfactory as that would be. On the contrary, the Permanent Secretary required a ministerial direction in April 2022 to start the implementation of the Rwanda partnership because he judged there was insufficient evidence of the deterrent effect that was suggested under the Rwanda scheme, and that there would therefore be value for money. That ministerial direction has not been revoked, and it's in force today with even more money being committed to this scheme. As the Institute for Government point out, permanent secretaries have a duty to seek a ministerial direction if they think a spending proposal breaches value for money, the value for money criteria. That is, if something else or doing nothing would be cheaper and better. It's in my opinion that on this basis, it's even more important that Parliament is able to scrutinise this scheme and have the full costs available. Less than 2 weeks ago, we learnt via the National Audit Office investigation that myself and the chair of the Public Accounts Committee had sought, that for each individual relocated to Rwanda, the UK government has committed to making payments to cover their asylum processing and operational costs and an integration package, and that these payments can last for 5 years and total £150,874 per person. Yet ministers had previously indicated that the cost per person payment to Rwanda would be similar to the per person cost of processing claims in the UK. Asked at the Home Affairs Committee what the UK processing cost was, the then minister responsible for illegal migration said it was £12,000, although we now know it's £21,000. And here's what else we've learned. The Home Office has committed to pay the Rwandan government £370 million under the Economic Transformation and Integration Fund, and they will also pay an additional £20,000 per individual relocated and a further £120 million once 300 people have been relocated. So that's in addition to the £150,874 per person for asylum processing and operational costs. And on top of this, we've also the direct costs incurred by the Home Office for managing and overseeing the scheme and for transporting people to Rwanda. As of February 24, the Home Office had incurred costs of £20 million, which it expects to rise to £28 million by the end of 23-24. The Home Office estimates that it will incur further costs of approximately £1 million per year in staff costs and £11,000 per individual per flight cost. And I'd be helpful if the Minister could let the House know if he now has an airline available to remove people to Rwanda, because that's another question we've not been able to get an answer to. It will also incur costs to escort individuals to Rwanda, which includes a training cost of £12.6 million in 24-25 and then £1 million per year thereafter in fixed costs, plus further escorting costs which are dependent on the number of flights required. This does not include, of course, the wider costs of implementing the Illegal Migration Act, such as providing sufficient detention facilities to hold people before they're relocated. So it would be helpful if the Minister could explain what arrangements are in place for that, linked to my question around capital costs. Can the Minister comment on whether he thinks it was a mistake not to make the full set of costs I've just listed known to members of the House, especially when members were legislating on this policy, but didn't have information available on the cost to make a judgment on the value for money of the policy? And why is it required an investigation by the National Audit Office to get basic factual information? Does the Minister think the Permanent Secretary is wrong in his assessment that there is insufficient evidence to demonstrate that the policy will have a deterrent effect significant enough to justify its cost? And if the Minister, is the Minister also able to assist the House with the numbers of people who will be sent to Rwanda under the Illegal Migration Act after the Safety of Rwanda Bill is enacted? And in recent days, it appears that the government will now be offering asylum seekers whose applications are unsuccessful £3,000 to voluntarily relocate to Rwanda, alongside those forcibly removed under the existing scheme, and that they too will be entitled to support for 5 years. Yes, I will. Yes, I'm just coming to...
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving me, because she's absolutely right about this point. The justification that we hear time and again from the government benches for the Rwanda scheme is that it is going to break the business model of the people smugglers and the people traffickers. Does she think that actually providing a voucher scheme for people traffickers is going to break their business model?
Well, I think the Honourable Gentleman makes his point very, very clearly then. I just want to go back to this new development that we've heard of in recent days, and just to ask the Minister if he could be very clear with the House about what the offer is that's being made for voluntary relocations, how many individuals will be eligible for the scheme, how much the Home Office has budgeted in total for the support costs. And I understand that the press are reporting that Home Office officials are calling asylum seekers to ask them if they would like to be sent to Rwanda. And is that actually correct? In conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, for Parliament to do its job, we do need a major cultural change at the Home Office. Calls for financial information must never be treated as irritating requests to be swatted away, but as part of the effective lifeblood of scrutiny and good governance. Big question marks hang over ministers' spending decisions on asylum and migration, particularly with regard to accommodation and the UK-Rwanda partnership. If the Home Office is confident about how its plans to spend public money, spend public money, it should have no problem at all in letting Parliament see the full details in advance of that money being spent. If it is not confident, then it must change tack, let the light of scrutiny into the Home Office and develop spending plans that it's actually willing to share with Parliament and the public.
Dame Priti Patel.
So, Deputy Speaker, first of all, it's a pleasure to follow the very thoughtful and considered remarks of the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee. And if I may just say, her forensic analysis of funding that has not actually been as transparent as it should be, and I'm going to come on to expand on this myself. I'm pleased to be able to speak on the estimates for the Home Office and actually make some wider observations about expenditure. But I should also say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, at the outset, that controlling expenditure in any government department clearly has its challenges, especially when events and circumstances, largely beyond any minister's or government's control, land upon a government, and COVID, the pandemic being one example of that. And I was in the Home Office during the pandemic, but also unforeseen events such as Ukraine, although we did end up planning for that, but also Operation Pitin, which, you know, was one of those very significant operations that cross-government you work on, and, you know, you scramble around and work out the funding and the finances per department afterwards, because there are a lot of operational costs. And as a result, of course, spending profiles change. And I also know, and I think I can sort of say this because I was once in the Treasury a long time ago, and people know my view on the fiscal form and fiscal fitness in government, but some of this can also have inflationary pressures. And by that I'm not just referring to the macro global economic pressures such as the Ukraine war, but actually more domestically, and as the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee has already pointed out, inflationary pressures when it comes to hotel costs, for example. You have the government effectively having a monopoly on hotel rooms that then drives prices up, and there is no real alternative and options if the government doesn't have a plan. And I'm going to come on to the type of plan that actually would not have led to the situation, the fiscal situation that the Home Office finds itself in now. It's inevitable, you know, during the pandemic, for example, responding to public health advice relating to asylum accommodation, no longer being able to detain, but actually having the distancing measures in asylum accommodation, and what that therefore meant actually led to the use of hotel use, and also action to respond to the growth in illegal migration, which the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee has already highlighted. And in fact, the very helpful, useful financial numbers that have been provided by the House of Commons Library, again, shows the figures over the last 5 years, the increases, but also since the baseline of the last spending review settlement in this particular area increases going up by 110%. So there are some very significant challenges here. Now, the Home Office, as the wonderful document from the Treasury on the central government supplementary estimates demonstrates, the Home Office has a wide range of responsibilities, including vital work around counter-terrorism activities and keeping our streets safe, support for the police uplift programme, work around violence reduction units, all announced by the Chancellor last year, or last week, and touched upon. But a lot of the investment measures that's gone into tackling domestic abuse and violence against women and girls, and the lead the department has taken on modern day slavery, is just so critical. That's now business as usual, and absolutely important, it really is. But of course, and again, the notes speak to the responsibilities around issuing visas and passports, and the income and the revenue that comes in from that to sustain it. And then, of course, control of our borders, immigration and asylum matters. And at the heart of these activities, ministers and budget holders must have value for money and transparency always at the forefront of their actions. My mantra was very known in every government department that I've stepped foot in. We must follow the money, people, activities and outcomes and be fiscally responsible. But as this debate has already shown, thanks to the introductory remarks from the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, we have to have transparency. And it is right that there is accountability and transparency around how key policy decisions come together. But having seen the figures in the supplementary estimates covering the Home Office, including over £4 billion of additional funding for resource for asylum support, resettlement and accommodation, there are a number of issues that are raised, which I know the front bench will look to address in their response. And if I may, this has been touched on already, but when it comes to asylum accommodation, it's obvious that it's not working. I think there are serious questions to be asked of the department and ministerial direction and decisions at least over the last 14 months. And I say this because, speaking to the point about public expenditure and transparency, a lot of, for example, Rwanda, and I'm going to come on to that shortly, but a lot of the proposals that link to the Nationality and Borders Act, for example, I know the chair of the Select Committee touched on the Illegal Migration Act as it now is. Our work touched on the new plan for immigration, which was a clear public document that looked at not just asylum accommodation but reform of the entire system, where you could break down the ultimate costs and be quite transparent about that by planning for future accommodation needs, working to establish the Greek-style reception centres and increase detained sites, which of course speaks to not even using hotels, but actually having government-funded accommodation, which would have assisted the government in processing claims quickly and promptly, which clearly is the crux of all of this, as the chair of the committee has pointed out, with processing claims going up by over 100%. There are serious questions to be asked there. Why was the digital level of processing around asylum claims that would have taken place in these centres not forthcoming, and why did that not materialise? And that's only one aspect of what should have been the new plan for immigration, and implementing these serious measures that would have led to financial transparency, but quite frankly, accountability around public spending. But also having the deterrent effect of those trying to enter the UK through dangerous and illegal routes, reducing the pull factor by having accommodation that, quite frankly, isn't moving around from one hotel after the other, but processing claims in these centres and having cost-effective solutions. And one example, if I may, Mr Deputy Speaker, the development of the site at Loughton-on-Ouse in 2022. That site should have been up and running by October 2022. It would now be in use, supporting the efforts to tackle illegal migration by accommodating over 1,500 people with detained facilities, and obviously addressing some of those wider issues that the government at the time sought to address. Of course, there were start-up costs with that, but of course, they're all now sort of blended into the estimates and the supplementary estimates and the 4 billion additional spending that is now being retrospectively sought. And again, as a result, the Home Office, because of scrapping and abandoning these plans, has fallen behind where it should have been on establishing a robust network of detention sites, proper accommodation facilities, proper processing plans, and transparency and digitalisation that would have led to fundamental reform of the asylum and accommodation system. And instead, this time last year, what do we have? Well, the chair of the Select Committee has touched on the infamous barge, Bibby Stockholm, and again, the set-up costs there. But in my district, in Braintree itself, what do we have? We have RAF Wethersfield and all the established problems that we now have there, and the additional start-up costs and all the supplementary costs that have gone in to deal with problems that were not even anticipated at the outset. And I have to say, some of these problems were ones that I had raised myself, around health outbreaks, for example, policing, the additional resourcing on policing, the costs that the local council has to pick up, including the county council. And when these decisions were made, concerns were raised about the suitability of these locations, and I have to say, I think it's incredibly disappointing that ministers at the time were incredibly tin-eared about all of this, and not transparent around the funding, not transparent around the decision making. And it was my local authorities in particular that had to work with me to get the information out of the Home Office. And as the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee will know, none of this information was readily available to the Select Committee, which is simply not acceptable. And I have to say, for my colleagues on the front bench in particular, I'm very conscious, if I may say so, they're having to pick up a lot of this because they were not ministers in the department at the time. And I do think it's incredibly unfair now. This is retrospective, the money that is now in these supplementary estimates, but there is an opportunity to go forward to be much more transparent and demonstrate that the department actually has learnt lessons from, quite frankly, the most appalling processes and the ministerial indifference that we saw in the Home Office, this over the last 12 months or so to actually improve this, because I think that's incredibly important, particularly while we're still dealing with many of these issues in Wethersfield, where it's supposed to reach full capacity now, about 1,700 people. Currently on site, we have around 1/3 of that level, but we do have a lot of issues. And again, those issues cost money. And the Home Office will bear the brunt of that through the various local authorities who are having to deal with this. Braintree District Council, Essex County Council in particular. On-site medical facilities, access to primary care, mental health, reasonable accommodation, the cost of transport, all the various associated costs. And now, of course, we have the issue around Class Q, but now a special development order has been issued, and what that actually means for the long-term costs of the department and running this site. Again, there is nothing that has been published, and my residents in Braintree District are left in the dark over this, along with, quite frankly, Parliament is as well, on the wider cost implications. Now, the associated costs with illegal migration are clearly staggering, and that's already been exposed. However, I think, if I may, this may speak to the recent publication of the reports by the former Borders Inspectorate, David Neal. There were other reports that were literally not just commissioned by the department, but we sought to publish them, which would have led to a much more robust approach around border force and the way in which border force agreements with France, but how the Home Office conducted its business, could have led to some serious reform, some good, prudent fiscal management, but importantly, some proper investment into technology at the border. And I suspect some of this was touched on by David Neal. And that, of course, was the review into border force conducted by Alexander Downer, who gave an excellent report. I don't know if the Home Affairs Select Committee even saw that report, but it seemed to be buried. And I know for a fact that there were some very serious and some good recommendations in there that would have absolutely led to some fundamental reform at the border, and I suspect David Neal would have also agreed with some of those measures too. The department has been silent on this, and I don't think there's been any progress. I don't think there's been any implementation on any of the recommendations. But of course, even the basic things such as better engagement with industry, developing better technologies, taking a more long-term strategic approach to border security is absolutely what was planned at the Home Office. I feel it's somewhat unfair to ask or demand the front bench to explain what has happened, but I think the House should know, because at the end of the day, these reports were commissioned to invest in the border, a digital border, long-term measures that would actually make our border much more secure, much more efficient, tackle issues such as illegal migration, but also the issue about documentation being disposed with when people were coming into our country, and all the wider challenges that, you know, my honourable friend the Minister is familiar with as well. And of course, that touched upon the work with France and the funding that we gave to France, which certainly since my departure now, I think has increased to over £500 million. I think, again, the public should know and hear much more as to what value for money that has brought, but importantly, what the outcomes are, because those are unprecedented sums. But again, how is increasing use of surveillance at the border being leveraged to actually go after the criminal gangs, more activity on patrol and law enforcement around the French coast? A very difficult French coastline, I should add as well, because of how large it is and how difficult it is to police. And I do want to pay tribute to everybody that works in this particular area. But, you know, so far, again, we've seen a number of Channel crossing arrivals pass over 3,500 alone, which obviously is higher than the same point last year. And it is important, I think, when £500 million is being spent, that, again, the public and the House sees a level of transparency around what is going on. I would, Mr Deputy Speaker, just like to touch on the Rwanda partnership. I think it's important, I really do. There'll be a debate in the House again on Monday around the bill, the Safety of Rwanda bill, when it comes back. But I think it is really important, and I say this because I negotiated the original partnership, and I came to the House and at the outset spelt out the original costings of £120 million. And that partnership was an economic and migration development partnership. It's quite clear that the principle of the Rwanda partnership currently as it stands, has moved miles away from the original economic and migration development partnership. And I have to say, I think that's deeply concerning. There has been zero transparency. As the chair of the Select Committee has pointed out, what on earth has gone on over the last 12 months around this partnership, other than funneling more public cash into this and to the government of Rwanda. And I would just like to say, on the government of Rwanda and the partnership originally, it was, in my view, a world-leading partnership, and other countries in Europe, I know to this day from conversations that I am having, are still looking to look at that model and may follow it because of various European countries also taking an interest because of wider migration issues across Europe and destabilisation in the world. But I do just want to say that there's been far too much criticism of the country and the government of Rwanda, and some of them are ill-informed, misleading and inaccurate. And I think actually for a country that has experienced significant economic growth, rising living standards this century, with 1 million more people lifted out of poverty in their own country and life expectancy increasing, it's important that we do not malign Rwanda. They joined the Commonwealth in 2009. They have worked with UNHCR to support over 130,000 refugees. And it is a country that is committed to playing a leadership role on the African continent, to make a contribution to tackling one of the biggest challenges that they face and we face, and I say they face on the African continent, which is that of mass migration. I want to pay tribute to the Foreign and International Cooperation Minister in Rwanda, Vincent Biruta, and the High Commissioner in London, because they have been outstanding in their engagement with the government and myself and others. And it's important that I think we make this partnership work. I am sceptical, I have to say, about what we've read about in the press. I think that's the best way to put it this week as to how that will work. Which does bring me on to the issue, which has been touched on already, that again, we have to be practical. The Home Office is an operational department. Operational, day-to-day operational costs inevitably are very high. But at the same time, when it comes to voluntary removals and reception centres, which we don't have right now, but actually even providing detained facilities and the cost of running detained facilities and the supporting staff that are required, it is right that we negotiate these contracts properly, transparently, and that I think everyone has the right kind of scrutiny that's required. And I say this because if something goes wrong, not just with those contracts, but when incidents happen, and they have happened in the past, where it leads to the Home Office then having legal action taken against them over a handling, for example, of a voluntary return or a migrant that is being removed, the challenges are just absolutely enormous. And the reputational... of course I will.
Does my right honourable friend recall that when the announcement was made about, I think it was the £500 million that was being made available to the French for some form of centre for processing these, the very next day the European Union announced that they weren't going to be allowed to do it. Doesn't that give us a very big message about potential waste of money on quite a big scale?
He makes a very important point, and actually he's given me the chance to just expand upon all this from an operational perspective. That was over a year ago when that was considered to be a flagship announcement from the government. And we have not seen that detention centre in France open up at all yet. I actually think it was due to open in 2025, but notwithstanding that, the government should report back. The government should report back what has happened to the money, what processes are in place, even updates in terms of that partnership that has been established. But my honourable friend mentions the EU, so that would have been the Commission in particular, who I have spent a lot of time with, and I think it was important to have those discussions as well. Do not forget that the Commission and the EU funded the Greek-style reception centres in Greece, which actually has gone a long way to deter illegal migration to Greece and actually to stop those awful crossings that were taking place. And I actually pay tribute to the former Minister for Interior in Greece, Notis Mikaratris, who did an outstanding job on this, and I worked with him to look at the replication of the Greek-style reception centres in the UK, because as we showed in the new plan for immigration, you could follow the money, you could develop operational plans that were transparent, and you could actually see the deterrent impact on that coming forward as well. And that is absolutely critical, it really is. My final point is very much to legislation that has passed this House in this entire space of asylum, illegal migration over the last 2 years. We've had 2 bills. One was last year, the Illegal Migration Act. The other one prior to that was when I was Home Secretary, which was the National Anti-Borders Act. I do want to put on record, and ministers will know my view, and everyone in government knows my view on this, I think it's really not good enough that having passed the legislation is not enacted. And the National Anti-Borders Act is the Act of Parliament that I will speak to on this particular point. Because again, if you want to follow the money and drive outcomes, enacting the legislation is absolutely crucial. And we had left in the department a fully costed operational plan on the inaction of the NABA, as it now is, which would have introduced the one-stop shop. So speaking to the point about reducing processing costs, for example, reducing the time it takes to process cases, the one-stop shop, the immigration courts and tribunals would have gone a long way to addressing that. And here we are, over 12 months, 14 months later since that has been enacted. That has not happened. Ditto on the reception centres and the accommodation centres. At the time, the costs were envisaged to be £120 million. That includes the start-up costs. The processing costs would obviously then come into that through digitalisation of asylum cases. I have to say, I think it's inexcusable that the needle has not been moved on that. And it is not acceptable anymore for people, once a revolving door comes in, to just sort of discard these plans and say, actually, we don't need those and we can have newer plans. Because all this does is kicks the can down the road and increases the level of government expenditure that takes place. And quite frankly, this unprecedented situation where retrospectively the Home Secretary of the day is trying to now get the approval of over £4 billion of public spending for asylum accommodation. So I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, whether it's the partnership with Rwanda, cross-border work with the French authorities, implementation of provisions in our legislation, delivery of accommodation centres. I can say that there were plans in place, absolutely, but, we must get back on track. And I think the purpose of today's debates as well should send out 2 messages. Yes, to the Home Office, but also for future spending reviews as well. I mean, we've had this period where it's been annual SR periods. We have to go back to 5-year SR periods. We have to have the proper fiscal transparency led by the Treasury. Ministers have to be held to account in terms of public expenditure. And we have to go back to the core principle of following money, people, outcomes. Thank you.
Alison Thewliss.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I stand to move the amendment in my name and that of my honourable colleagues. As the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee has so clearly laid out, there has been frustration among members of the committee about the opacity of Home Office spending. There's been obfuscation, delay, denial, downright sleekness over many, many months. And still, in reading the supplementary estimates in front of us, it's very difficult to get right to the bottom of what money has been spent when they come forward for this retrospective approval today. Members on the government benches, current and former Home Office ministers, are all prepared to weigh in publicly and call outrage on the spending of the Home Office, but yet trying to get any clarity on how the department utilises its budget has been like trying to nail jelly to a wall. I would agree that spending appears to be out of control, but it's the utter incompetence and the abject cruelty at the heart of the Home Office that makes things so much worse. If the Home Office were overspending, but at least having a decent set of outcomes and treating people humanely, I'd perhaps be a wee bit more forgiving. But instead, they're presiding over a chaotic, mean and dangerous system where those who are unlucky enough to become in its orbit are drawn into a dystopian nightmare. It's a pity that due to the timing of this debate that we're not able to have sight of the National Audit Office's report on asylum accommodation, which is due to be published on Wednesday. And I hope the Minister will come to the House to talk to that next week. We do have information, however, on what kind of service is being provided. Just this week, the food charity Sustain, working with Jesuit Refugee Service UK and Lifesavers Aid, published their research, which found that people seeking asylum do not have access to sufficient money, kitchen facilities or food to meet their needs, are provided with food that does not meet food hygiene or nutritional standards, in some cases resulting in hospitalisation. Experiences of food were broadly experienced as degrading and dehumanising, especially for mothers unable to feed their children adequately. This desperately poor and deeply harmful experience is being provided by Home Office contractors who have seen their profits soar. Clear Springs and Stay Belvedere Hotels Limited, for example, have made a combined profit of over 113 million. Serco and Mears are also profiting handsomely from these lucrative contracts. The UK government often make the claim that they want to support displaced people closer to the place from where they have fled. Yet the supplementary estimates reveal that they are now quite brazenly pockling the official development assistance budget to the tune of £3.2 million, a staggering 389.6% increase from the sum just in the main estimates. Now, this is supposed to be money to help the world's most vulnerable, to support countries and to help them flourish. Instead, it's simply boosting the profits of companies who are demonstrably not even providing the very basics of humanity. The facilities such as the Bibby Stockholm, Napier Barracks, Wethersfield and Scampton are being presented as some kind of alternative to hotels, but in many cases they can cost just as much, if not more, and are no better run. And hotels cost so much because of the delays the Home Office are presiding over. People left waiting, not just for months, but for years at a time without a decision. And the former Immigration Minister had the cheek to say on Sky News that this was quite deliberately so. We don't want to speed it up because then that would make the UK too attractive. They're presiding over their own failure quite deliberately and quite purposefully. So if the Minister comes here today to say, oh, it's terrible we're spending so much money on hotels, I would ask him to speed up those applications and let people get on with their lives. The Bibby Stockholm barge is estimated to cost taxpayers £41,000 a day, £15 million a year. With around 300 asylum seekers being housed on the barge, this equates to a cost of about £205 per day per person, the same as perhaps an overnight stay in a 4-star hotel. Thrown into the indefinite stay in a shared room in an industrial barge moored in an operational port, however, you get the bonus of Legionella bacteria in the water supply, as well as anxiety, depression, respiratory illness, infectious diseases, and unfortunately, seeing some of your fellow inmates committing suicide. I haven't had much of an opportunity to speak about the visit to the Bibby Stockholm that the Home Affairs Committee carried out, but I want to put on record at this opportunity the sadness, the confusion, the frustration of those on board. Men who felt that they were being punished for some unknown misdemeanour, unable to get any peace and quiet, living in impossibly close proximity to people for months at a time with no certainty to when that will end. Health needs not being properly assessed. The vessel not intended for people to be living on 24/7. And despite the tabloid rhetoric, none of those that I met on that boat had come on small boats. Some indeed had been international students forced to claim asylum when the political situation deteriorated in their home countries. One told me, the longer you're in here, you turn into a person you don't know. How incredibly sad that the UK government feels fit to treat people in this way. I will.
I completely agree with what the Honourable Lady has just said about our visit to the Bibby Stockholm. And does she agree with me that what Wendy Williams said in her review around the Windrush scandal about the Home Office remembering that it's the face behind the case, seems to have been lost in some of the way that we're now treating some of the asylum seekers?
She's absolutely correct to point that out. And in reading some of the reports from the Independent Chief Inspector, it was very clear that that policy has all been abandoned. You know, people have lost the sense that you're dealing with actual human beings, with stories, with dignity, with a past, with a future. But these things have been completely lost altogether. People are treated so much less than if they were actual human beings, and that's quite appalling from any government, but very appalling to listen to those stories and to hear what people had been through and what they continue to suffer in these circumstances. Home Office officials have reportedly raised significant concerns over the cost and feasibility of housing asylum seekers at MDP Wethersfield in Essex and RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire. In addition to the near £15 million to another private contractor to set it up, it's estimated it will cost around £72 million per year to accommodate people at Wethersfield, a site about which the now former Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration raised serious concerns about safety. He said there was an overwhelming feeling of hopelessness caused by boredom, which invariably, in my experience, leads to violence. This is before the site is even at full capacity, so it would be useful to know from the Minister what is he doing to address those concerns of violence at this site, because the Chief Inspector was very clear to the committee how worried he was about that. A report published in December by the Helen Bamber Foundation and the Human Rights Network further found that the asylum accommodation site at Wethersfield is causing significant and irreparable harm to residents and recommended that it be shut down as a matter of urgency. And not only will the public cover the cost of the woeful conditions at Wethersfield, but they are also het for the government's court fees in any upcoming legal battles. Scampton, similarly, comes in at an estimated £109 million this year. The detention estate has been growing arms and legs over the past few years, and the estimates provided by the Home Office suggest that this trend is only set to continue. The cost of detaining someone for one day is estimated at around £113 per person. Expanding the detention estate at Campsfield House and Hazard Immigration Removal Centres is expected to come in at around £260 million. Ludicrously, the Home Office has made quite a deliberate choice to pursue these more expensive, more punitive options, despite having clear evidence from the pilots that they themselves commissioned into alternatives to detention, which were found to be significantly cheaper, more effective, and with much better health outcomes for those within that system. It's no secret, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the SNP think the Rwanda scheme is irredeemably awful. It is unworkable, conspicuous punishment. The Supreme Court has found the scheme to be unlawful, and on top of all of this, it is, of course, eye-wateringly expensive. I would like to thank the National Audit Office for their report setting out the known sums so clearly. And I find it quite wild, actually, that the former Home Secretary, the Honourable Member for Witham, comes here today to criticise the ball that she herself started rolling. I guess it hasn't worked out the way that she expected, but I couldn't really see what she thought would be so great about this scheme in the first place. The UK's Rwanda scheme has cost around £220 million so far under the UK-Rwanda partnership, not including the UK government's legal costs of defending the plan in the courts. The Home Affairs Select Committee finally received evidence in November last year that in addition to the money already sent, additional payments would be made to the government of Rwanda each year. Quite unbelievably, some of this was only uncovered because somebody in Rwanda let slip to the International Monetary Fund, not through due diligence to our own Parliament, to the parliamentary committees that are supposed to scrutinise these things, but because of a slip in some other documentation. There's a direct cost of £20 million to the Home Office, which the National Audit Office says is expected to rise to £28 million by the end of 23-24. There will be the £1 million a year in staff costs, £11,000 in flight costs per individual, and as yet unknown costs to escort those individuals to Rwanda. There's also the bounty to Rwanda for the delivery of the first 300 asylum seekers, which is a further one-off £120 million. Whether or not you believe 300 will actually be sent, the fact is that this is within the documentation. The National Audit Office report sets out a further payment schedule for each person removed to Rwanda up to a total of £150,874 each. But again, it's entirely unclear how much this will all add up to in the end, because it actually depends on somebody staying put once they've got to Rwanda, which nobody can guarantee. The National Audit Office numbers say the numbers are inherently uncertain. I would say that's putting it pretty mildly. And of course, it doesn't save any money. The UK government's own figures estimated that removing an asylum seeker to Rwanda would cost £63,000 more than keeping them in the UK to process. So it's no wonder the Permanent Secretary wouldn't sign it off without ministerial direction. Now, I don't seek in any way to malign Rwanda or its government, but there is a curious dichotomy that comes from the benches opposite, where Rwanda is both safe, but enough so that the legislation will pass, but also sufficiently scary as to serve as a deterrent to those desperate enough to risk their lives crossing the channel in a flimsy inflatable. It can't be both scary and safe at the same time. It can't be a deterrent and also something perfectly reasonable. Those two things cannot exist together. And bizarrely, we had the news just today from Lizzie Dearden at The Independent that the Home Office is now so desperate to fill up these flights that it's offering as an option to those who have not successful asylum claims that they'll be given £3,000 to go to Rwanda. Absolutely wild stuff. Again, something that has not been brought to this House as a proposal. It has not had any further scrutiny as a plan, of course.
I thank the member for giving way. She's making an excellent speech. Not every country in Europe behaves in the same way or tries to outsource or evade its human rights obligations by exporting refugees and asylum seekers. Does she not think that we ought to be giving the right to work to asylum seekers much quicker so that they can take part in the labour force and actually contribute to the economy rather than being held at great expense in totally unsatisfactory and often totally appalling conditions?
The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely correct in what he says, and it entirely flips this argument that the government has that asylum seekers are some kind of burden on its head, because many of them have skills that they very much wish to bring to our workforce. Many of them have things that they wish to contribute. They want to say thank you for being given the sanctuary that they have. They have a lot to offer to the UK, but the UK government isn't interested in that. It does not see them, as I said before, as people with skills to contribute in any meaningful way. And that is desperately sad. The Migration Observatory at Oxford University has also suggested that a value for money assessment should take account of asylum seekers who are neither deterred from coming nor removed to Rwanda, because these are now left in a limbo of the Home Office's own making. They cannot have their asylum claim processed, nor in most cases be removed to a home country because of the Illegal Migration Act 2023. They're inadmissible, they're unable to work, to contribute, to move on to their lives. Who exactly does this situation benefit, and where on earth is the Home Office going to accommodate them? They cannot say. None of this is sustainable. The new backlog replaced the old one. Over 12,000 people are now appealing to the First Tier Tribunal due to the slapdash decisions made in haste to meet the Prime Minister's target last year. Safe and legal routes have been closed down. Money has been given hand over fist to France and Belgium, while the Home Office's own staff are being left without the resources that they need to do their jobs effectively. The Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, in his report on asylum casework, noted that staff had taken demotions rather than continuous caseworkers, and that their managers had tried to shield their teams from the difficult messages coming at them from above. And The Guardian has revealed this afternoon that the Atlas database flaws have left 76,000 people listed with incorrect names, photographs, immigration status, cases combined together. What an absolute guddle this system is. The Home Office is now under investigation, I understand, from the Information Commissioner due to their absolute incompetence and inability to process cases properly. The Home Office has pulled off the quite astonishing feat of creating an asylum system which is simultaneously slow, expensive, shoddy, and in some cases unlawful besides. This wastefulness is a pattern of behaviour for a department which appears to regard those who come to our shores as somehow less than human. In a cost of living crisis, the Rwanda scheme is a bottomless pit for public funds. The UK government, either under the Tories or the Labour Party, can't find the money for an essentials guarantee, to scrap the two-child limit, for cost of living support for people struggling every day, but yet when it comes to dog whistle politics, there's a big blank cheque. There are limitations on what we can do as MPs about this. The estimates and the budgetary processes are entirely inadequate for this purpose, particularly in light of a department prone to secrecy and misdirection. My SNP colleagues and I have put forward an amendment to reduce resources for use for current purposes by £740,850,000 relating to immigration and asylum. And this pertains to our best estimate of the supplementary estimates to defund the Rwanda plan, the Baby Stockholm, Wethersfield, Scampton, Campsfield and Haslam IRCs. It is a small part of what the Home Office has wasted on schemes which have absolutely no merit and will cause more harm than they ever will good. And I commend our amendment to the House.
Hear, hear. The question was, as on the order paper, since when a motion has been moved to reduce the resources. The question is, the motion to reduce the resources as on the order paper. Tim Loughton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to speak to the main motion. I listened to the Honourable Lady. I'm not entirely sure that she made the case for why we should reduce resources to the Home Office. But I want to certainly agree with much and try not to repeat much of what the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee said. It has been a labour of love, certainly a long labour of love, to try and get relevant information out of Home Office officials. And anything approaching financial figures are always met with a degree of reluctance and opaqueness. And even with the Home Affairs Select Committee, described only yesterday as Westminster's best committee in a leading newspaper by a leading journalist, has been frustrated with the problems we've had when interrogating officials from the Home Office. I in no way direct that criticism at the Minister, who's on the front bench at the moment, and his colleagues, who have been something of a breath of fresh air, but certainly, having been a member of the Home Affairs Select Committee now for 10 years, it's never been worse than it has in terms of our relations with officials and getting information out of them, which is a great shame because we have an important job to do. We are the scrutinisers of the Home Office, not least because they don't have one in the form of a Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, which is what this debate is about this afternoon, after the recent unfortunate demise of the excellent David Neal, who has yet to be replaced. So the work that the Home Affairs Select Committee does is even more important at the moment to try and fill part of that vacuum as best we can. Now, this is an estimates day. It's about figures, and it's a really complex area. The whole budget figure that we are looking at is 23.6 billion for the Home Office for 24-25, and the largest increase of 3.9 billion is for asylum support and accommodation, a figure which has risen by 733% over the last 5 years. And net legal migration hit a record of 745,000 in the last year. But most of the spend within this area of the department, and certainly most of the increased spend, is on illegal, or should we call it irregular, immigration, or people arriving here without prior permission and subsequently able either to stay because they're permitted to stay, or because they can, for all practical purposes, not actually be deported for various reasons. Now, the Home Office account split between 4 areas of spending: day-to-day spending, investment spending, resource day-to-day spend, and capital. But I want to strip it down into 5 main areas under irregular immigration headlines. First of all, it's the money that we're spending largely in France on trying to prevent those people coming here in a regular way in the first place. Second, it's the cost of processing those irregular migrants when they do arrive in our territorial waters and then on our shores, and the cost of accommodation and policing, secure accommodation or hotels, and the cost of delays and the backlog, or queues, as the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee put it. We now have to refer to it. Thirdly, there is the cost of returning people when we can return them, where there are agreements in place. Fourthly, is the cost of those we can't return, or those who then do return to countries we couldn't otherwise return them to because they take a voluntary payment, including the cost of the Rwanda scheme. And there is absolutely at the heart of all this, Madam Deputy Speaker, is to address that vital question, a question which the opposition have absolutely failed to answer at every time they've been challenged. What do you do with those people who have come here irregularly, be it through little boats, paying people smugglers, or through lorries or other means, who've had their asylum claims firmly rejected, yet come from countries where it is practically impossible to return them, places like Iran and Eritrea and others. And that's why the Rwanda scheme and a lot of this irregular migration spend is going to try and come up with a solution to that particular problem. And the fifth area is a slightly related area, is the cost of the big net increases that we've seen in legal migration to infrastructure and services in the UK, where much of the impact of that spend actually falls on other departments as well. And added to all of those areas related today is now the question of who is overseeing whether this substantial investment is achieving what it intends to achieve in the absence of the Chief Inspector of Borders in migration. Now, I think it's really important to put into context the whole spend and the whole activity of the Home Office on migration. Too often we hear about what a waste of money on the Rwanda scheme, although a lot of it is upfront costs. But it has to be seen in the context of what we're spending on hotel accommodation in this country, whilst those people are here who shouldn't come here in the first place, and we are unable to send them to their original or to a third country. Of course I will.
I think it's important. I mean, my honourable friend is making a really, really important point here, but it's also imperative that we recognise that some of the spending is based on anticipated forecasts, and we constantly hear from within the Home Office the forecasts that they're expecting on irregular migrants coming through, small boat arrivals, etc., etc. And actually there is a methodology that can be applied to be much more transparent about the funding that's allocated, and also the type of deterrent measures that can be put in place, along with all the other additional costs. But they should be really transparent about all of that.
Well, I'm sure my friend is absolutely right that there is methodology that's being used, and figures could be available. But the opaqueness that is applied to prevent the Home Affairs Select Committee and anybody else who wants to try and get to the bottom of those figures to see if we are getting value for money, let alone cost effectiveness, is really, really frustrating. But the Home Office must have those calculations, as I'm sure she saw in her time at the head of the Home Office, and frankly they should be available to Parliament and those who scrutinise their activities. So let me briefly just look at the first of those. Effectively, the £480 million subsidy we're giving to the French police force to police their beaches to try and stop those people getting to the boats in the first place. Now, we know the number of interceptions has gone up. The trouble is they don't arrest those people by and large, and so they are free to try again the following night and the following night and the following night with a new boat, a new dinghy from China, from Turkey and from other sources. And we've seen all the fantastic kit that they've got, the drones, the ribs, the June buggies that we've all been on the Home Affairs Select Committee. But the trouble is people are still getting through. And in the absence of French cooperation in actually detaining and processing the status of those people in France, as they do in Belgium, where we just don't have this problem as we saw when we went there first hand, that is why we have this problem. There's also the whole question about what the French are doing with this kit, because certainly there are stories that some of the night drone capability which we provided to them is being used in the south of the country, policing the Mediterranean rather than the Channel, and money has gone on microwaves and things like that as well. So are we getting value for money from that 480 million or so that we are giving to the French police force? I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
The Honourable Member for giving way, and he's making a very valuable point about money. £480 million, which, if I read him correctly, he's suggesting we are spending in protection along the French coast, which isn't being effective. If you add that to all the millions, the hundreds of millions that have been spent on the Rwanda scheme, which so far has done nothing, would you not agree with me that perhaps if we had been less obsessed with solving the problem at its end, and not investing the money in improving the conditions in those countries, in international development, and in safe legal routes, and in making it viable for people to stay in those countries, we wouldn't have this problem now.
Well, I think there's a number of rather conflicting arguments to the point she's just made. And the first point I made, I'm not sure if she's here, there right at the top of my speech, was that we need to see this spend in the whole context of, if we're spending this money here, it's because there's an alternative. We're having to spend even more there because we haven't solved it at source. Where I do absolutely agree with her, and as somebody who absolutely defended the 0.7% commitment to overseas spending, is this is a global problem where international cooperation is needed to make sure people have more of an incentive and a viability and sustainability to stay in those countries from which they are departing, not necessarily through civil war and because they are they're being put in danger themselves, but because of economic conditions linked to climate change, because that's why we have such a large migration from near equatorial sub-Saharan countries and so on. So I completely agree with that. And she knows my position on safe and legal routes. I put those amendments to the legal migration bill. The government does need to do more and will do more on safe and legal routes, but coupled with being much tougher then on those who would not use safe and legal routes because they have no legitimate case for actually applying for asylum in the United Kingdom. And those are the people we need to come down on absolutely hard, trying to prevent them coming here in the first place, and when they do come here, doing everything we possibly can to remove them from the country as soon as possible. I see my friend Johnson. Wait.
I'm listening with great interest to my honourable friend's very authoritative speech, but there's one paradox which always strikes me about giving money to the French in order to stop the small boats coming, and that is, if they ever succeeded in stopping the small boats coming, that would mean that France would be the end of the line for those illegal immigrants. And that would mean that the French would start having to impose their own borders, which have largely been dismantled in the context of the EU, in order to stop the illegal migration into their country. So can we ever really expect the French to cooperate in really sealing off the illegal route across the Channel?
Well, I think the response to that is up to an extent, Lord Cobber, because the issue is, and actually when you speak to the French, when you speak to migrants around Calais, and the authorities trying to deal with it there as we did, which is why they said that the year before last, when the government announced the Rwanda scheme, they saw a big surge in migrants around Calais approaching the French authorities to try and regularise their position in France because they didn't want to risk being put on a plane to Rwanda. Why are so many of the migrants in the north of France around Calais? They've come into France because they think there's a chance they can get to the UK. If it was very clear they couldn't get to the UK because they had been stopped by whatever means, hopefully by the French intercepting them in the water or on the beach and bringing them back, so they've paid money for a round trip, then they wouldn't necessarily have to come into France as well. So there are different aspects to that. If my friend will allow me, because there are a couple of other people I know want to speak, and I've got a few other things I want to make. If I come to my second point, and that's the whole cost of processing, where I think there are self-inflicted costs here because the Home Office took too long to increase some of the caseworkers to speed up the time it took, as they have now done, or it still needs to go further. But as of September of last year, the asylum backlog, brackets Q, close brackets, was 165,411, which was up 11% on the previous year, but up 372% over the 5-year period. We've now seen a fourfold increase in the number of decisions. But in addition to that, of course, and an aspect which the Home Affairs Select Committee was particularly concerned about, last year 17,316 asylum seekers withdrew their applications for asylum, and the Permanent Secretary and his number 2 at the Home Office were singularly incapable of telling us what had happened to those 17,316 people who withdrew their applications and why they'd withdrawn them, and to assure us that they'd withdrawn them because they were leaving the UK. It subsequently turned out that an awful lot of them had not left the UK, and still rather a lot of them, about a third, are the whereabouts of them is unknown to the Home Office. So it would be interesting to know from the Minister what the backlog stroke queue actually is now, what audit has been done about the cost effectiveness of the recruiting additional case workers, and how that's fed through to quicker processing times, and how that's benefited us financially, and the efficiencies of faster processing. We also need to know the breakdown of costs of accommodation and subsistence for asylum claims that are in limbo. The former Immigration Minister, the Right Honourable Gentleman for Newark, stated that the Home Office was spending £8.3 million a day, this was last year, on hotel accommodation, about £140 per night, since which some hotels have been taken out of circulation for that, which is good progress, and hopefully that £8.3 million cost per day is reducing. But how much is spent on accommodating those who are awaiting initial decisions, especially over the last 6 months that they've been waiting? Secondly, how much is spent on accommodating those who's had their claims rejected but are still going through additional appeals processes, or they've gone through appeals processes but we cannot still deport them to their country of origin? Or thirdly, how much we're spending on those for whom claims have been accepted and have leave to remain, but for whom there's a shortage of long-term accommodation to transfer them to more appropriate accommodation. And that's the problem we have with Afghan families who were here legitimately, airlifted from Kabul airport, who after years were still staying in hotels, largely because of larger families for which it was difficult to find that accommodation of larger houses. Completely unsuitable to have children in hotels for years at a time when they've got to go to school and try and socialise with other children as well. Now, as at the end of last year, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are 111,132 individuals in receipt of asylum support. That was down 10% on September, the previous quarter, but it still included about 45,500 in hotel accommodation. So how much, if the Minister can tell us, is that hotel accommodation decreasing, at what rate, and how much is the cost reducing? The third area I just want to touch on, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the cost of those people that we can return. It's interesting, there was an article in the FT in which I was quoted earlier this week that raised the concern about the shortage of detention spaces. Now we have the problem about all those people who've come here since the illegal migration bill, who have no status to be here. This is a growing number for whom they are not in jail. They're presumably on bail, and some may disappear into the ether. The cost of Brook House, which the Home Affairs Select Committee will be visiting next week, where there are many people there who've been there for rather a long time because of the continuous appeals that they've got. How much is that costing? What's the cost of agreements with countries like Albania, where we have got those returns agreements? All these are costs on the immigration and asylum budget. Very quickly, but I will move on.
I'm very grateful to him, and he's been very generous. There is also an important point about these returns agreements and removing individuals. Costs aside, I don't know whether or not the government has implemented this, but Section 40 of the National Anti-Borders Act actually amended Section 24 of the Immigration Act 1971 to cover the issues of re-entry bans. Because unless that is actually enforced, that also leads to the very point and the problems and the issues that my honourable friend is alluding to. So further costs, pressures on accommodation, and then an entire process being restarted all over again.
My right-hand friend is absolutely right, and there are stories which are not apocryphal, and I've heard on good authority, of people who have been returned from the UK to Albania under an agreement, have been accompanied there by officers, and that officer has then returned to Heathrow or Gatwick Airport or whatever, and seen the person they just returned to Albania in the queue ahead of them, having come back into the country. So there are ways and means of getting back into the country, and enforcement is absolutely crucial to this. Otherwise, it's a complete joke, and a very expensive joke, that we're returning people on a temporary basis where it should be a permanent arrangement, until and unless they apply legitimately and are accepted legitimately to come to the UK because they've got a reason to be accepted under our terms. And also, then there's the whole issue of the Rwanda scheme. And if we look at the figures, now all sorts of figures have been bandied around about the actual cost. The Home Office has only disclosed 140 million in the first year of the deal, and absolutely accepted there are all sorts of start-up costs. So I'm not troubled by the fact we're paying money up front. And of course, the Rwandans have said that if the scheme doesn't actually take off literally, then they will return at least part, if not most of the money. So there are some assurances there. But even if the figure that we're spending on the Rwanda scheme turned out to be, say, 500 million, well, based on the 8.3 million cost per day of hotels, for example, that's just 2 months' worth of hotels. So if we look at the figures, actually there is an economic case to be investing in the Rwanda scheme, because the alternative is those people would stay in hotels at an expensive rate if we can't find alternative, cheaper accommodation. But still, it won't be long before the Rwanda scheme has paid for itself. So we must look at it holistically in the round, Madam Deputy Speaker. So if I can just finish on just a few questions again to leave in the lap of the Minister. There is the overall issue of why are we accepting so many people with their asylum claims in the UK? France receives more asylum applications, but rejects twice as many as we do. Why is the threshold apparently somewhat lower in this country than many other European countries? There's also, we must take account that some of the returns figures have been slightly distorted because in its rush to clear some of the backlog, invariably the Home Office has gone for low-hanging fruit, some of the easier cases to accept, children, women and others, so that the acceptance rates artificially look higher because they haven't dealt with the more problematic cases who are more likely to be rejected. They've gone for the easier ones to determine favourably for in the first place. Now also, in 2023, the number of people granted refugee status was the highest on record of over 62,000. So why is our threshold so much lower than the rest of Europe? And what calculations have the Home Office made about the financial savings will be made if we were to toughen up that threshold, raise that threshold, and we're going to be rejecting more claims in the future? And also there's the point I made earlier about what happens to those in limbo since the Illegal Migration Act came into force. And does the Minister anticipate that we may have to issue some sort of amnesty, as we did previously, for those people to be able to have their claims looked at rather than they don't qualify to have their claims assessed at all? And the final point is the changes that we have seen today to immigration rules, which have been heralded by the Minister before, which I welcome, because there are certain people coming here who, frankly, they are dependents that it's not necessary for them to come with the primary visa applicant, and they are likely to be a cost rather than a contributor to the exchequer. Now, there are reasons for why we should do that in certain cases, but if one looks at the 2021 census, the population on the previous census rose by 7.4%, but resources and infrastructure has not risen comparatively. The number of GP surgeries over that 10-year period is only up by 4%. The number of secondary schools is only up by 4.9%. So the population is rising, and indeed it's forecast that there will be 6.1 million more migrants by 2036. And working people aged between 20 to 64 born in the UK have a much higher rate of employment than people who migrated to the UK. Now, look, Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree immigration is good, but it's not all types of immigration that are necessarily adding to the UK economy rather than drawing on it. So it's right that we need to be more discriminating in those people who we do allow in, absolutely those who are genuine refugees fleeing danger, that they have a case for safe haven in the UK, but others who are coming as dependents who aren't necessarily going to be contributing to the UK, then I think we need to clamp down on that more, as the Home Office has the announcement it's made today. So, large part of this policy is about addressing irregular migration. And if anybody disagrees with it, then frankly it's incumbent upon them to come up with their solution for how we deal with people coming to this country with no legitimate, credible case to be able to claim asylum and to be given safe haven here. That is where an awful lot of the money is going. It's absolutely right that we should be able to scrutinise that money properly, and it's absolutely right that the government needs to give answers to where that money is being used effectively. But I absolutely give credit to the government for trying to come up with proper sustainable solutions like Rwanda is to deal with all the costs of a very inefficient migration system where we are being very unfairly treated with people who are choosing to pay people smugglers to come across the channel in the most dangerous, in an appropriate way, with absolutely no credible case for us giving them safe haven in the UK. And frankly, those are the people who are jumping the queue, and the biggest victims are those genuine asylum seekers to whom we've always had a good and generous tradition of giving safe haven to, and those are the ones absolutely we need to be able to focus on, and we're spending far too much money on those people who are frankly gaming our system.
Joanna Chen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to focus my comments on the cost of the government's Rwandan policy, particularly as I visited Rwanda, Kigali, 2 weeks ago as chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, and the committee is going to report on our visit in due course, so any comments I make today are in my personal capacity. But I think it was good that the chair of the Home Affairs Committee reminded us how the information about the cost of this scheme had to be, well, not even dragged out of the government, they still haven't come out of the government, they've come from the National Audit Office and other sources, as she said. And I really do query whether the scheme is value for money and also whether it's going to work as a deterrent. We heard from the chair of the Home Affairs Committee about the huge increase in the asylum support, resettlement and accommodation budget. And I think it's important to put it in context by looking at how many asylum seekers actually come to the United Kingdom every year. And if we look at recent figures, we can say that in the most recent year, asylum claims related to about 84,000 individuals. So let's say about 80,000 individuals. Let's just bear that figure in mind for what I'm going to say in a minute, because when I was in Rwanda, and I'm going to say something about Rwanda in a second because I completely agree with the Right Honourable Member for Witham and what she said, although I think it's important not to be rude about the Rwandans themselves, because I think they are a good people, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But when I was in Rwanda, I asked government officials how many asylum seekers they expect to receive from the UK, and they told me they expect to receive 2,000 over the first 4 months, and then 10,000 over the next 5 years. Now that's about 2,000 per annum. Compare that to the 80,000 asylum seekers who come here every year. It's 2.5%. What are the government proposing to do with the rest of them? We need to know about those costs. And really, the central point I want to make today, and what little time I have, is we need an asylum seeking and a system for asylum seekers who come to the United Kingdom. That we need to go back to basics. We need to think about an efficient, a cost-effective system, but it has to be a system whereby the United Kingdom takes its fair share. And if you look at the figures, the Joint Committee on Human Rights have heard evidence about this. If you look at the figures for displaced people and refugees, there's 36 million refugees in the world. The idea that they're all coming to the United Kingdom is absolutely ludicrous. But to return to my trip to Rwanda, I just want to give my own impressions here, because I think my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow Central, makes a very good point about saying, how can it be that how can Rwanda be both a great place to be and safe, but also a deterrent at the same time? And I've formed a pretty clear view as to why it is a deterrent. And what I really want to say is that I agree with the UK Supreme Court, based on my visits in Rwanda, that I think the Rwandan government and the Rwandan people are in good faith. But I also agree with the House of Lords Committee, who looked at this, that the system that's needed in Rwanda, the relevant legislation hasn't finished going through Parliament yet, the system's in its infancy, training's in its infancy. It's going to take a long time for the Rwandans to create an asylum seekers system. Yeah, we visited accommodation. The accommodation was of a very high quality. We only saw one of the reception areas, but I can tell you, Madam Deputy Speaker, it was a hell of a lot nicer than the Bibi Stockholm. And perhaps that's because, owing to their recent history, 80% of Rwandans themselves have been refugees. And they were at pains to remind us of how many refugees they've welcomed over the border from Burundi and the Congo, and how they see, and I quote, refugees as their friends, their brothers and sisters. And I was very struck by how that does not accord with the current discourse in the United Kingdom. Perhaps the UK government should take a leaf out of the Rwandans' book and see refugees as their friends, their brothers and sisters. That might make it easier for them to devise a cost-effective system whereby we take our fair share. Yes, Rwanda has a written constitution. But very few people were able to point to any case law showing people taking advantage of their rights under that constitution. The Rwandan government withdrew in 2016 the right for Rwandan citizens to individually petition the African Court of Human Rights because they didn't like the decisions it was making about their dissidents. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? But most importantly, perhaps, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the Home Office in the United Kingdom have prepared a 137-page country information note on human rights in Rwanda, which collates sources ranging from the US State Department to Human Rights Watch, setting out very serious shortcomings in the protection of human rights in Rwanda. And we took evidence before we went from dissidents who had concerns about their human rights. And I've written elsewhere about my concern about the protection of LGBT rights in Rwanda. Basically, at best, Rwanda is where the United Kingdom was 50 years ago. 50 years ago. Yes, it's not criminal to be gay or transgender, but you have no positive rights and you live in a society where stigmatisation and discrimination is common. And nobody was able to give me any examples of anyone being able to exercise their rights through the courts. Yes, I'll give way.
For giving way, is it not also concerning that the government's own travel advice on Rwanda states that they cannot guarantee the safety of any LGBT people?
Indeed it is. And I raised this when I guested at the Home Affairs Committee. I raised this with the government minister that we tell LGBT Brits going to Rwanda, you need to be careful, we can't guarantee your safety, but we're quite happy now to send LGBT asylum seekers there. I could say a lot more about Rwanda, but I think it's important to understand why it is a deterrent. People who come here to seek asylum often come because they've left their country because they've criticised the government, because they're a human rights defender, or because they're gay or transgender. Rwanda is not an attractive country for them in the way that the United Kingdom is at present. But just to return briefly to the stats, and then I'm going to sit down, Madam Deputy Speaker. Bear in mind the figure that one of the figures that the Chair of the Home Affairs Committee gave us earlier. Let me just find my page here. It was that the cost for sending the Rwandans, the UK would pay around £150,000 per person relocated to Rwanda to cover asylum processing and integration over the first 5 years. If you apply that to the figure of 12,000 that I was given by the Rwandan authorities, then that is billions and billions of pounds on that figure alone. On what basis can that be said to be cost effective? Billions and billions of pounds spent in sending less than 2.5% of the people who come to these shores seeking asylum to Rwanda. It's a gimmick. The government should own up that it's a gimmick. The government should not be spending taxpayers' money on a gimmick and a sop for their backbenchers. And I'd like to hear what the Minister has to say about the points that I've made.
Thank you. Order. I had thought that we had lots of time for this debate, but of course everything expands. So I'd be grateful if now if the two remaining backbench speakers would possibly take around 8 minutes each, then we will manage to get everyone in fairly. And we'll begin with Patrick Grady.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I will certainly do my best. Of course, the debate might have expanded even further if anybody from the Labour backbenches, other than the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, had turned up. We in the SNP benches get accused of disengaging from this place, but there have been 4 of us who've contributed to the debate today, compared with only 1 from the official opposition. And yet estimates debates should be one of the most important sets of debates every year. This is the process by which we approve billions of pounds of government expenditure. In front of us, nearly £8 billion set aside for the Home Office. And as you know, Madam Deputy Speaker, many of us in the SNP take a great interest in the estimates, both in the process and in the substance of their approval. Not so long ago, my honourable friend, should be right honourable friend for North Perthshire, found himself being called to order and had to leave the chamber for daring to try to debate the estimates on estimates days. because we had been assured back then by the then Leader of the House that the estimates process was the way to make sure that Scotland's voice was heard on questions of government expenditure and Barnett consequentials, and that the English Votes for English Laws procedure would not stifle the votes or voices from members of Scotland. Well, we may have been delivered from evil in this House, but if there is any positive legacy from those unlamented procedures, it is that estimates days are now set aside for the discussion of estimates, and we could debate and indeed vote on detailed aspects of government expenditure. That doesn't mean that the process isn't still woefully lacking in terms of effectiveness and the ability to propose substantive changes. In other legislatures, there can be line-by-line examination of a government's budget and spending plans, and members can propose detailed amendments to direct funds to their priority policies or communities. That's not an option available to us today, but I do congratulate my honourable friend for Glasgow Central and our estimable colleagues in the SNP Whip's office for their ingenuity in bringing forward the amendment before us today. Because the expenditure of the Home Office, particularly on asylum and immigration, certainly does warrant scrutiny and amendment. When ministers say that sums are vast, and indeed the sums spent on asylum accommodation are too high, they're not wrong. But their solutions, their alternatives, are wrong, very wrong. As the member for Islington North said, the most straightforward and simplest way, and also most practical and dignified solution to the question of asylum accommodation is to give asylum seekers the right to work, to allow them to pay for their own accommodation. Instead of costing the taxpayer money, let them become taxpayers. Let asylum seekers contribute to the Treasury and to our economy and to our communities. If members opposite are genuinely concerned about community cohesion and integration, surely the way to build that is not to ostracise and other asylum seekers, but allow them to play an active, positive role in our society and economy. There are plenty of examples of where immigration in that sense can work. Look at the contribution the Syrian community have made to life on Scotland's islands since that resettlement scheme was introduced. Look at how Ukrainians have been welcomed into homes and families and schools and workplaces across the country through those schemes. And of course, we've spoken many times about the impact that Afghans have had in Glasgow, not least through Glasgow United. Glasgow Afghan United, headed up by my good friend Councillor Abdul Bastani, and I invite the Minister to come to Glasgow and meet with refugees and asylum seekers, such as those supported by Glasgow Afghan United and Maryhill Integration Network.
I thank the member for giving way. The member was pointing out earlier, the number of asylum seekers, even those coming on small boats, would not be accommodated under the current plan in Rwanda anyway, if that should go ahead. But is he not aware that many of the people trying to cross from Calais, and I've been to Calais and met them, are desperate people, some of whom are victims of war, some of whom are victims of war in Afghanistan, and some of whom are victims of war in Afghanistan because they worked for the British forces in Afghanistan. Surely we need to have a slightly more humanitarian approach to what are very desperate people.
Yes, I agree entirely. The safe and legal routes that do exist for Ukrainians, Syrians and some Afghans are exceptions to the rule, the exceptions to the hostile environment that starts, frankly, with anybody who gets off a plane and has to wait in interminable queues at the UK border to get through passport control, and a hostile environment that can end with the prospect of being deported to Rwanda if the Home Secretary doesn't like the cut of your jib. For the past 9 years or so, Madam Deputy Speaker, asylum and immigration and visa cases have been at the very top of the constituency caseload I have in Glasgow North. Way back in 2015, a constituent came to see me who was literally a rocket scientist who wanted to contribute to world-class engineering projects at our universities, and yet the Home Office was attempting to refuse her a visa. I've lost track of the number of academics and musicians and artists and religious ministers, sometimes even just holidaymakers, whose visits to the UK have been cancelled or curtailed by Home Office hostility and inefficiency. Families whose reunions have been denied, small business owners who've given up and moved away, funerals and weddings missed because the default position of the Home Office is suspicion and hostility to anyone who wants to come here unless they are stinking rich, in which case they're very welcome to come straight through the door on a gold-plated visa. Even as other parts of the government proclaim that Britain is great, who say we need and want skilled and talented entrepreneurs and graduates, the Home Office says no, Britain is closed. I visited British embassies and high commissions in parts of Africa, festooned with bunting and adverts for achieving scholarships, and then gone to dinner that evening with young people who couldn't take up their scholarship because their visa was denied. I have visited the Visa Processing Centre in Lilongwe in Malawi, and I was very grateful for the time they gave me and the efficiency with which they carry out their role. They take biometrics, they process the paperwork, and they do so quickly and effectively. But the applications get stuck at the point of decision-making, not in Malawi, not with input from the excellent High Commission team there, but at a remote centre in Pretoria, and that causes frustration and confusion and too often disappointment among the visa applications and applicants. And all of that speaks to inefficiencies, systemic and systematic failures within the Home Office. I want to touch briefly on the question of the Rwanda scheme, as many others have. £1.8 million per person for the first 3 potential deportees, according to the National Audit Office. I had a look online the other day. You can get a full year's full board in Disneyland Paris for £100,000 a year. And the Prime Minister and the Minister at the Dispatch Box have said to me that the reason they think Rwanda's a deterrent is because it's not the UK. Well, Disneyland Paris is not the UK. So there's a quicker and cheaper way of perhaps deterring people. And if that sounds absurd, Madam Deputy Speaker, that's because the whole scheme is absurd. We've touched on the question of ODA as well. And it would be interesting to know whether any of the funding under the UK Rwanda Migration Economic Partnership or the treaty with Rwanda is going to be classed as ODA. But as I said to the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, even if the UK government has to count some of the money spent on supporting Ukrainian refugees as ODA, that should not be an excuse to minimise the amount of ODA being spent elsewhere by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. It should never have abandoned the 0.7% in the target in the first place. It broke across party consensus to do that. In an independent Scotland, the 0.7% target would be a floor, not a ceiling for our spending and supporting some of the poorest and most vulnerable people around the world. But then in an independent Scotland, many things will be different, and in stark contrast, the decay and decline of Westminster under successive governments of whatever hue. The Scottish Government has printed commendable papers explaining what a humane asylum, immigration and migration policy would look like. And of course, Brexit has only added to all of these costs. For generations, Madam Deputy Speaker, people have left Scotland to make their homes elsewhere in the world because they were cleared for their land to make way for sheep, because their crops failed, because they wanted to join friends and family who'd gone before them, because they have skills and talents that they want to put to use in an economy or society that could benefit from those skills and talents. And today, many people from elsewhere in the world want to make their homes in Scotland and the rest of the UK for precisely the same reasons. But the UK government says no. It spends vast amounts of money saying no, and it refuses to allow the devolved administrations to do anything different. So it seems that devolution is in fact the real separatism, and with independence we will rejoin the world and play our part as an open and welcoming good global citizen.
Michael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to take part in this debate, which I think is very necessary and indeed timely. I think it's necessary because I think there has been a common thread that has run through just about every contribution we've heard here, and it is about the lack of transparency and accountability about the way in which the Home Office goes about its business and how it accounts for the way in which it goes about its business to this House. I say it's timely because The Guardian, as the Honourable Lady from Glasgow Central said earlier, has published an article today around Home Office immigration database errors that affect more than 76,000 people. The Honourable Lady, I think, said that it was a guddle. I think that is, if I may say so, an uncharacteristic understatement on her part. I think it certainly meets the test for being called a right burach, in fact. At its heart, they have the Atlas system, which is a tool used by immigration officers and Home Office officials for the processing of any asylum or immigration dealings, and that in itself is underpinned by the snappily titled Person-Centric Data Platform. Now, the Person-Centric Data Platform stores a migrant's interactions with the UK immigration systems over time, including visa applications, identity documents and biometric information. It stores the records of 177 million people and is part of a Home Office project to digitise fully visa and immigration systems that has cost more than £400 million since 2014. The PCDP records feed into Atlas so that border force officials can view information and indeed some people seeking to track their own applications can access them. And this is where the problems come to light. There is an issue of something called merged identities. So essentially merged identities, as I understand it, are two ordinary people, but where for example, Madam Deputy Speaker, you may have an application that is live, so you go in, you find my picture attached to your data, or vice versa. Now, how on earth can you possibly hope, if you are a Home Office official processing applications, to make sense of that? And indeed, if you are the person who is accessing this information online, then of course you're immediately going to be upset and alarmed at what you're finding, because this is something that has very profound feelings. So this is not just an issue of data mismanagement, and as the Honourable Lady from Glasgow South said, the Information Commissioner's Office, I understand, is looking at this. It is also something which strikes at the right and opportunity of an individual to access some of the most basic services, rented housing, accommodation, healthcare, and so much else. Now, the issue that there is a substantive issue itself. Clearly, this is yet another botched government IT project. But the issue of process matters here as well. Members of this House have been asking about the operation of Atlas and the PCDP, and they've been given assurances by ministers. The Honourable Member for Corby, who had hoped might be in the debate today, but fortunately for him, maybe he's not. He's given written answers to the House to say that Parliament, he's told in written answers there are no systemic issues that have been identified with Atlas. But the documents which have been seen by The Guardian today clearly contradict that. Now, either the Minister has been misled by his officials, or he's been told something by his officials that he didn't think Parliament would want to, or it would be advantageous for him for Parliament to hear, so the information and the answers have been framed in a particular way. Either way, it is clear that the culture within the Home Office is one which does not respect parliamentary accountability, and I would hope that when the Minister does come to reply to the debate, he will tell the House what the government knew about the problems with the Atlas system, with the person-centric data platform that underpins it, when they knew that, and why they have not brought information about this to the House. The Guardian has done a tremendous service to this House by exposing the full extent of Home Office failure. We now really need to... But, you know, that should not be necessary. We shouldn't be relying on investigative journalists from people and from people blowing whistles from inside the Home Office. We should be able to take and trust what we are told, but we're told very little. And on the basis of what we've read in The Guardian today, it seems that it's something even then that we cannot trust.
Shadow Minister Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Backbench Business Committee for securing this important debate, and I'd like to pay tribute to the Chair of the Select Committee for her powerful opening speech and for the outstanding work that she is doing on these issues. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Home Office spending figures detailing an astronomical overspend of £5.9 billion last year represent such a shockingly cavalier attitude to taxpayers' money that it really does beg a belief. 2/3 of that £5.9 billion was for asylum costs, a staggering £4.3 billion overspend over the past 12 months, taking the total spend on emergency asylum hotels and asylum seeker support up to a quite astonishing £5.4 billion. These costs also include a whopping £1.2 billion to pay for the implementation of the Illegal Migration Act, which, let us not forget, has not even been implemented yet. We also know that should the government manage to be able to realise its fever dream of sending asylum seekers rather than Home Secretaries to Rwanda, the first 300 will cost an astonishing £570 million and account for just 1% of the 30,000 asylum seekers who crossed the Channel in small boats last year. That works out at almost £2 million per asylum seeker, Madam Deputy Speaker. Just let that sink in for a minute. £2 million of British taxpayers' money to send one asylum seeker to Rwanda. Madam Deputy Speaker, the country knows it, this House knows it, the Home Secretary knows it, and the Minister knows it. The Rwanda scheme is the worst value for money policy in history. Now, the Conservatives will point to the asylum seekers crossing the Channel, and it is correct to say that more than 100,000 have made that perilous journey since 2018, which is when the party opposite started to well and truly lose control of our borders. It's also correct to say that of that 100,000, a staggering 40,000 have crossed since the current Prime Minister was appointed by default, which tells you all you need to know about his vacuous Stop the Boat pledge and how it's going. We on these benches are clear that tackling the Tory boats chaos cannot be achieved through headline-chasing gimmicks such as the Rwanda plan, which just absorb vast amounts of money, time and resources. Instead, we need a laser-like focus on the practical, common-sense measures that get the job done, which is why Labour has set out a detailed plan to smash the criminal smuggler gangs that are running Britain's borders and trading in human misery. If this government cannot restore order to the border, Madam Deputy Speaker, then the next Labour government will. But the fact of the matter is that the asylum backlog had already grown fourfold even before the small boats started coming in large numbers. It was the Conservative government's decision to downgrade the seniority of asylum decision makers in 2013 that led to the backlog spiralling due to slower, poorer quality decision making and larger numbers of appeals, plus high staff turnover, resulting in the total chaos that we are now seeing. Let's not forget that the government has an estate of more than 50,000 relatively cost-effective asylum beds that keep the system within budget. But the use of nearly 400 hotels last year to house as many as 56,000 asylum seekers at any one time has sent costs through the roof. According to the House of Commons Library, spending on asylum hotels and support has increased by an astonishing 733% in the last 5 years alone. This is what happens when you try to cut corners and cut costs, Madam Deputy Speaker. You end up paying 10 times as much in the long term, clearing up the mess that you've made. It is the definition of a false economy. Labour has a plan to clear the backlog within 1 year by surging the number of caseworkers, thus saving the taxpayer £2 billion in hotel bills. We will also create a new returns unit with 1,000 immigration enforcement officers to remove people from safe countries who have failed in their asylum claims. These are the key pillars of our plan for a firm, fair and well-managed asylum system. Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, Britain faces a forced migration challenge caused by increasing geopolitical turbulence and the proliferation of authoritarian regimes, with violence and persecution spreading across the world. But this government has completely and utterly failed to rise to that challenge. Successive Home Secretaries have had ample opportunity since the small boats started coming in large numbers in 2018 to work with our European partners and allies to end the vile trade of people smuggling in the Channel. But rather than seeking to engage constructively, they've spent the last 6 years trashing their working relationships with our European neighbours through their damaging rhetoric and frequent promises to break or ignore international laws and treaties. They have traded hard graft, quiet diplomacy and common sense for unworkable legislation and headline-chasing gimmicks that are not based on reality and are therefore destined to fail. And meanwhile, the public's been forced to watch on helplessly as the criminal gangs have taken hold, with prosecutions of people smugglers down a startling 34% since 2010. We are clear that cooperation with Europe is the only way to restore our border security. Labour has promised a cross-border police unit to go after the criminal gangs upstream by forging a new security partnership with Europol, based on intelligence sharing and joint working, paid for by redirecting some of the vast sums of money that are being squandered on the Rwanda shambles. So, given the central role that the Minister is playing in all this, I have the following questions for him. The Prime Minister had promised to end the use of hotels for asylum seekers by the end of last year. Can the Minister therefore explain why, at the end of December, there were still more than 46,000 asylum seekers in hotel accommodation? Second, we now know that hundreds of millions of pounds have been committed to the Rwandan government as part of the Tories' failed plan. Can the Minister tell me how much of that the UK will get back if no flights take off? Can the Minister explain why the Rwanda money couldn't have been invested in border security instead? Does the Minister truly believe that spending nearly £2 million on every person sent to Rwanda just to get a few symbolic flights off the ground, to quote a previous immigration minister, in an election year, represents good value for taxpayers' money? And does he agree that Rwanda is the worst value for money policy in history? The NAO revealed that the Home Office would spend £11,000 per person on flights to Rwanda. Can the Minister explain why taxpayers are paying 11 times as much as a commercial flight would cost? Madam Deputy Speaker, the failures of the Home Office ministers are not just impacting their own budgets and overspends, they're causing severe challenges for other government departments and for local councils. As my honourable friend, the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, has pointed out, a huge amount of this is being channelled through Overseas Development Aid, or ODA. That is having a huge impact in terms of the amount of ODA that is available to spend in countries which are generating large numbers of asylum seekers, and also in countries which neighbour those countries. So it really is a lose-lose situation. The money that should be being spent to address push factors is instead being spent on hotel bills here in this country. So can the Minister also set out whether he feels that it is a viable long-term strategy to be using ODA in this way? And does he agree that it is the very definition of robbing Peter to pay Paul and working against the strategic objectives of ODA and of what any sensible government should be doing in terms of addressing the crisis that we're facing in our asylum system? The latest estimates are part of a long-running and increasingly predictable pattern. The Home Office goes cap in hand to the Treasury, asking for billions of pounds over and above what was already a multi-billion pound annual budget to deal with a set of crises entirely of the government's own making. The Treasury then duly signs blank cheque upon blank cheque to the Home Office, and yet still somehow manages to make matters worse. Ministers are trying to claim an alternative to Rwanda would somehow be more expensive. But the problem with that argument is they're comparing the Rwanda plan to the cost of doing nothing. They are not comparing the Rwanda plan to Labour's common sense plan to go after the gangs, to get removals back up and running, and to clear the backlog. Madam Deputy Speaker, the other immigration minister, I think it was, once said that it is not acceptable to spend £8 million a day, equivalent to some 3 billion a year on the asylum system. I couldn't agree more. It should not be necessary to remind him that it's on his party's watch that the cost of the asylum system has rocketed tenfold since 2010. That, Madam Deputy Speaker, is why those on the benches opposite need to get out of the way, so that we on these benches can restore order at our border and fix this broken and unaffordable Tory asylum system. So let's have that general election, and let's have it now. Thank you.
Minister Michael Tomlinson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you very much indeed. And may I start, as other honourable and right honourable members have done, by paying tribute and praising the chair of the Select Committee, which I think has been reported as the most effective. I'll come back to that point, as the most effective Select Committee in town. But may I seriously state that she does an important and a vital job. May I just gently suggest a couple of things? It's sad to see that she's so lonely and on her own on the Labour benches, and I know that the honourable member for Glasgow North has made that point. It's nice to agree with the honourable member for Glasgow North on something, and I agree with him at least on that. But with due respect to her, she has carried out her role forensically and with diligence, as she always does. She's occasionally, Madam Deputy Speaker, critical of the government front benches. That's part of her role. She's entitled to be. But in terms of her accusations of transparency, may I just gently push back a little bit and state how much of a pleasure it was to appear in front of her committee within hours of being appointed to this role, alongside my honourable friend, the member for Corby. And I know that, in fact, my honourable friend, the member for Corby, enjoyed his experience so much that he came back even this week, and certainly from the reports that I've seen, it was a genuinely constructive and instructive exchange from those on the Select Committee and the evidence that was given then at that stage. But before I turn to the details that she set out and the details of this debate, of course it's right to say that this government needs no reminding that the taxpayers' interests must come first and foremost when determining our approach to the asylum and immigration systems. And it's right to say that no one has done more than this government on shining a spotlight on the costs, the overall costs and the public money that is being spent, not least every day, to house those asylum seekers in hotels. I'll come back in a few moments, if I may, to the details on that. But my honourable friend, the member for Corby, has confirmed that his pledge has been exceeded, and that in fact more than the 50 hotels that he pledged to be closed have been closed by the end of January. And again on Rwanda, I will come back to the details shortly, but it is right to say why, at this stage, why the partnership is needed. It's needed because we cannot go on with a situation where there are fatalities in the Channel. Madam Deputy Speaker, for the last 8 consecutive months, people have been dying attempting to cross the Channel. There is a moral case, there is a compassionate case for saying that we must stop the boats, and that is the mission, that is my mission, and that is one that I am determined to carry. Of course I'll give way to that.
Appreciate that those of us who question the Rwandan scheme are not doing it because we don't think the boats should be stopped. We're doing it because we think the Rwandan scheme is not the way to do it, and that it's not value for money. And those are the issues he really needs to address in the short time he has left, whether the Rwandan scheme is value for money.
Well, I'll come back to the Honourable and Learned Lady's points, and she made a series of points, and she's right that she led a select committee visit to Rwanda. I very much look forward to seeing the details of that report. My point is that there is a moral case and a compassionate case for the Rwanda scheme, and if time allows, I will delve into the details of that. But if time doesn't allow, there will be further exchanges on Monday and doubtless in the future in relation to the Rwanda scheme. But because the Honourable Member for Glasgow North was so kind enough to invite me to come to Glasgow, may I just turn to his contribution first and briefly, if I may I endorse his points about no one being here from the Labour benches. It's perhaps instructive as to where their priorities are that not a single backbencher, other than the chair of the Select Committee, is here in the chamber to address what, in my view, is the single biggest global challenge facing not just the United Kingdom, not just France, not just the EU, but the whole world, and not a single other Labour backbencher is there. The Honourable Member for Glasgow North spoke well and powerfully on that point, and I agree with him entirely. Of course I'll give way.
I think it's worth pointing out that the Labour members of the Home Affairs Select Committee, 2 of whom are representing Parliament at the United Nations this week at the Women's Equality Summit. So I'm sure otherwise they would be here supporting us, as other honourable members of the committee are here as well.
I'm very grateful indeed to the Right Honourable Lady for that point, but there are other members of Parliament who represent the Labour Party other than those 2. At least there are at the moment in any event. So may I once again pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Glasgow North for his points on that. Can I just directly say, yes, I would love to come to Glasgow. Of course I would. He teased and tempted me with football. If I can perhaps encourage him to find a cricket team, then I will certainly be willing to go up. My footballing skills are not as they once were. But seriously, I take him up on that offer. And I look forward to being there. I disagree with him on the Rwanda scheme. He won't be surprised to hear me say that, and I hope I have the chance today, and if not today, on Monday, to set out more details on that. But can I also disagree with him on this point? He had an exchange with the Right Honourable Member for Islington North about the plea to allow illegal migrants to work in this country. I disagree fundamentally with that point. It will be interesting to see if that's a point that the Labour front bench pick up and accept as their policy, because that is not my policy, that is not our policy. The Right Honourable Member for Kingston, of course I give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. The point I was making was that unlike other countries that do encourage and allow asylum seekers and those that have been granted asylum to work in a rapid manner from arriving in their country, we don't. we lose an awful lot of skill, an awful lot of people that could make a huge contribution to our lives and our economy, and we spend a great deal of money preventing them from working. We could change the attitude and change the approach on this.
I understand the Right Honourable Member's point. I disagree with it fundamentally. It would act as a pull factor. It would be not a deterrent. It would be the opposite of a deterrent. It would be a pull factor and an encouraging factor, and I'll be very interested to see if that's a policy that the Labour Party adopts. So far, they've been pretty silent on what their plans are, but it sounds like that may well be one of them. May I turn directly to my Right Honourable friend, the member for Witham. May I thank her for her thoughtful and considered remarks as well. She rightly praised the Right Honourable Lady, the member, the chair of the Select Committee. She was right to do so. But can I also praise her for her diligence and for being in the chamber for such an important debate. Her expertise in Treasury matters, in Home Affairs matters, has come together during the course of this debate, and the chamber is grateful for her contribution. Can I agree with her on the Nationalities and Borders Act, and again pay tribute to her for taking that through Parliament? And can I allow her to... will she allow me to say that I will reflect on her points, particularly in relation to the one-stop shop? I know it's something that she has championed. Let me take that point away. But in terms of the deterrent effect, the overall deterrent effect, I agree with her on that. She mentioned the technology and the borders. She was right to do so in the Downer review. She will, I hope, be reassured that there is progress that is being made, perhaps not as fast as she would like, and she will know my impatience on this subject as well. We will and we must crack on with that. In terms of the money going to Rwanda, she is right. It's an economic migration and development partnership, and the Home Secretary set that out. She was right to do so as well. Can I just mention that education, healthcare, agriculture, infrastructure, these are the sorts of things that that money is going to support. I know that she will welcome that. The Honourable Member for Glasgow Central, I know she moved her amendment. I would encourage Honourable Members to disagree with that amendment. I don't think we should be spending less money in this area. May I come to my Honourable friend, the Member for East Worthing and Shoreham? He rightly asked the challengers, what do you do with those who are here irregularly, with those who have had their asylum cases rejected, to whom you cannot return to Iran or to Eritrea? That challenge, that question, has been posed time and again to those on the opposite benches, and answer comes there none. The third country scheme, the Rwanda scheme, is the answer to that challenge, and that's why I'm so determined to see it through, and I'm sure we'll have further exchanges on that as the bill comes through the House in terms of ping-pong next week. Can I also thank and praise him for his diligence on the Home Affairs Select Committee for the past 10 years. Although he may be superficially charming, Madam Deputy Speaker, he is equally challenging, if not more challenging, to the front bench than the opposition members. And certainly when he gets his pen out and asks those detailed questions, the ministers have to make sure that they are at the ready. He rightly challenges the French partnership. I agree with him. I know the Select Committee has been out to France and to see the work that is there. Work is increasing. More French personnel are now deployed. It is beginning to have an effect. He will know and will have seen the numbers that were reduced from last year. Crossings down by 36%. We must increase that. We must redouble our efforts as well. He asked challenging questions about the backlog. The direct answer to his question is 95,252 as of the end of December, down by 28%. We must increase that downward trajectory, and we must increase the upward trajectory in terms of caseworkers and decision makers. Over 2,500 are in place, and may I pay tribute to each and every one. Madam Deputy Speaker, I must, in due deference, give time to the Chair of the Select Committee to wind up in the final few minutes. We will return to the subject of Rwanda on Monday, but may I pay tribute finally to the Chair of the Select Committee for her forensic and for bringing this debate to the chamber of the House of Commons. There will be further debates on Monday, and it will be nice to hear more details, or a detail, of what Labour have to offer on this, because so far they have nothing to offer at all.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think this has been an excellent debate, well represented by members of the Home Affairs Select Committee, including the Deputy Chair and the spokesperson for the SNP, who's a very valued member of the committee. We've had the former Home Secretary speaking and the Chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights. think the key theme that I want the Minister to take away, that I think almost every speaker referred to, was the lack of transparency from the Home Office. That's the issue that I want the Minister and his colleagues to address. Parliament is not a rubber stamp for whatever the Home Office wishes it can do. They have to be accountable to the Home Affairs Select Committee and to Parliament more generally, and I look forward to future meetings of the committee where ministers will come equipped with all the information that is necessary for our committee to carry out effective scrutiny on behalf of the House.
Order. I'm now required to put the questions necessary. The clerks are wondering if it's 5 o'clock. It's not quite 5 o'clock, but by the time I say it, it will be 5 o'clock. I'm now required to put the questions necessary to dispose of proceedings on the estimates set down for consideration this day. The first question is the motion on the supplementary estimate for 2023-24 for the Department for Education, which was debated today. As members of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And so we come to the questions on the supplementary estimate for 2023-24 for the Home Office, which were debated today. The question is the motion in the name of Alison Thewliss that resources for use for current purposes be reduced by £740,850,000 relating to asylum and migration. As members of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobby. Order. The question is the original question. No, it isn't. The question is the motion in the name of Alison Thewliss that resources for use for current purposes be reduced by £740,850,000 relating to asylum and migration. As members of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Peter Grant and Gavin Newlands. Tellers for the noes, Joy Morrissey and Mark Jenkinson. Order! Order!
The ayes to the right, 36. The noes to the left, 220.
The ayes to the right, 36. The noes to the left, 220. So the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock. The question is the original question on the supplementary estimate for 2023 to 24 for the Home Office, as on the order paper. As matters that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. With the leave of the House, I will put the questions on motions 2, 3, 4 and 5 together. Minister to move formally. The question is motions 2, 3, 4 and 5 as on the order papers. Members of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. So I will put the question on motion 6, supplementary estimates 2023. If you really want to be chatting, then you shouldn't be sitting right there. Question is that on motions number 5, Minister to move formally. 6. I beg your pardon. Let's do that again. Put the question on motion number 6, Minister to move formally.
I beg to move.
The question is motion number 6, as on the order papers. Members of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Division. Clear the lobby. The question is motion number 5 as on the order papers. Is that opinion? The question is motion number 6 as on the order paper. As well as that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division. Oh, tell us for the aye.
Let's just go cool it off.
Tell us for the ayes, Peter Grant and Gavin Newlands. Tell us for the no, Joy Morrissey and Mark Jenkinson. Order! Order!
The ayes to the right, 218. The noes to the left, 35.
The ayes to the right, 218. The noes to the left, 35. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. Bill ordered to be brought in upon the motions relating to... Oh, shall we do 7? Oh, very well. I will put the question on motion number 7 now. Minister, to move formally.
I beg to move.
The question is motion number 7 as on the order papers. May that opinion say aye? Wonderful to hear such enthusiasm. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And now, bill ordered to be brought in upon the motions relating to excesses 2022 to 23, supplementary estimates 2023 to 24, and vote on account 2024 to 25. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
The Chairman of Ways and Means, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Laura Trott, Bim Athalami, Gareth Davis and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Clark, aren't you going to say? Oh, you wanted to bring it in first?
Oh, very good. Good bow.
Super.
Supply and Appropriation Anticipation and Adjustments Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to have a fellow Essex member in the chair.